Hello, everyone, and welcome to Relic Law's Interview with an Expert series. I'm William Orlowitz, Principal Attorney at Relic Law. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Deborah Kish, Executive Vice President of Research and Marketing at FSU, who will be taking our questions on file-level protection of sensitive data. So let's jump right in, Deborah. Can you first tell us a little bit about yourself and FSU?
Thanks, Will. And yes, so at FSU, we actually focus on unstructured data security solutions, and we essentially have products that discover, classify, protect. We can monitor, control, track, and expire access to content wherever it travels or resides. We have a secure collaboration tool where end users can share information internally or externally, sensitive information, while always meeting corporate governance and regulatory requirements. And we use a file-centric approach that uses encryption with a unique identifier that allows companies to actually increase their visibility and control over unstructured data.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I think that's a really relevant topic for a lot of organizations at this particular point in time. So let's go ahead and jump right into the first question here. So can you really tell us a little bit more about, what unstructured data is and what forms does it really take in a typical corporate environment?
Sure. So unstructured data is actually a couple of things. It's data that is sometimes used, not sometimes, but a lot of the times used for analytical purposes. So a lot of companies use data that comes in that gives them insight into, shopping preferences and things like that so that they can make better decisions. But another form of unstructured data is data that's typically in files or in common applications like Microsoft Office or text files. PDFs is another common form of unstructured data, or images like BMP or TIFF files. Another form is actually designs that have been created in computer-assisted design, so CAD applications. Now, most businesses have unstructured data for analytics, but all businesses, this is really important, all businesses have unstructured data that are in common files like Microsoft Office and PDFs.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like it's something that's pretty industry agnostic. It applies to virtually any business I can think of. And, in working with various types of clients in various industries, we see, all the types of information you mentioned, everything from, CAD models and design files to, things that are proprietary or confidential in bitmaps. And then obviously all the document level type stuff, which is obviously contains sensitive information. So I think that kind of takes us into question two, which is, what are the types of security risks that, apply to unstructured data?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that doesn't often get thought of. So I think the first risk is the fact that it's actually growing. And when I say growing, it's kind of out of control. Many a research firm has stated that roughly 80% of a business's data is unstructured, which is a lot. And most companies don't even realize that a lot of the documents, I'm not saying that all the documents, but a lot of the documents that are being created or manipulated and copied or even shared have sensitive information in them, whether that's, PII or personally identifiable information, names, addresses, social security numbers and whatnot, or maybe information that's sensitive to the business, like, maybe a recipe for the vaccination for COVID-19 or next generation braking for cars and trucks. The sheer growth in data alone is a risk, or at least poses risks to the company. So, yeah, but you actually asked about, no, go ahead. I was just going to say, but you actually asked about security risks. So I sort of wanted to, liaise into security risks, which is a little bit different than growth. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think it's actually the pure vulnerability to people, insider theft, accidents, and even misuse. And there are plenty of examples that I can cite that have been in the news where, like a malicious employee downloaded information onto USB drive, So I think, Anthony Lewandowski between Google, Waymo, and Uber, Morgan Stanley, GlaxoSmithKline, LED lighting manufacturer Cree, although Cree got lucky. The USB drive evidently fell out of the pocket of the person who took the information, and it was found by somebody on a sidewalk and returned to the company.
Unbelievable.
So, yeah, but all these companies had incidents related to malicious employees stealing intellectual property. But what's important here is that it's not only the competitive advantage hit to these companies, but the litigation costs that are part of it. And, I think it's kind of funny that I'm talking to a law firm about this, so you probably know what I'm talking about here. But it can and does go into the millions, if not billions of dollars. I mean, most of the time you don't hear about these incidents, but it happens to a lot of businesses regardless of their size.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And from the legal side, we counsel clients obviously on their legal exposure with respect to data loss and security threats in general, whether they're internal or external to the organization. And certainly, when it comes to sensitive intellectual property, the loss of that information can be extremely high, and obviously cost the company its competitive advantages. And oftentimes the ability to recover is difficult. The law provides certain remedies, but they're not always easily ascertained. And so, preventing something from happening on the front end is far more valuable, I think, than being able to have to pursue it on the back end. And so that's why I think that, in working with clients and trying to help them identify their risks and deploy solutions that help them solve those risks or at least minimize them, is always a valuable conversation. But I think that's a good segue into our third question, which is, so how does an organization identify and classify sort of that, unstructured data within its environment? Because that's sort of like the first step is knowing what you have, right?
Yeah, it is. But I kind of wanted to go back on question 2 because there's more than just that risk. I mean, the vulnerability to insider theft and misuse, but there's another point that I wanted to touch on, which is accidents. People are people. We all make mistakes. I mean, I've done it myself, accidentally sending sensitive information to the wrong person through an email or whatever, because, let's face it, we're all busy, and things like autofill in an email can totally get you into trouble. And when I think about, accidents, with the current environment in response to the pandemic, a lot of people were actually sent home to, go work remotely. And most businesses were not prepared for that at all, where essentially overnight people are now working in their homes without the protection of the network, or, which creates printing vulnerabilities. And, I heard about crashing VPNs, and the internet was overloaded. Some people may simply circumvent procedure just to get their job done. And now everything is done over video conferencing, so there may be a lot of accidental sharing of documents being more commonplace today because there's just so much more communication that way. So I'm not sure what exactly the ratio of mistakes that happen in an office versus at home, but I would actually venture to guess that more mistakes are or will be made in remote workforce circumstances simply because of what I just said, and more means more, essentially. And another thing that I would be remiss if I didn't mention the risks associated with information that's subject to privacy regulations. So PII makes its way into Word files or Excel spreadsheets. All that is absolutely at risk if it's not properly protected. And there have been a lot of GDPR violations cited for what they call insufficient technical and organization measures to ensure information security. And those violations, essentially lead to fines.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. And in truth, from what we see, inadvertent disclosures tend to be, obviously far more common than the alternative, where something was done intentionally. There's mistakes that happen, as you mentioned, in various ways, emails are misaddressed, or information is accidentally provided to someone who shouldn't otherwise have access, and all of those scenarios. And they're quite common. They happen on a daily basis. And clients have to understand that their obligations, with respect to certain privacy laws, are going to require, a full response following that incident, including potentially notifying the affected individuals. And so, engaging in that activity can be very costly. And so, as you mentioned, it's important to think about just those common things that aren't necessarily malicious, but still result in pain and additional expense.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So those are the biggest risks that I see that directly relate to unstructured data. I mean, it's uncommon to hear about a hacker grabbing a bunch of documents from a system or through ransomware attack. I mean, it could happen. It's just not very common.
Mm-hmm. No, that's true. I think as a percentage, it's far lower than the inadvertent disclosures that I think happen almost routinely on sometimes a regular basis.
Yeah.
So looking at those risks and trying to, obviously figure out the best approach to addressing them, what does an organization do if it has just, a large amount of sort of unidentified information in its environment? What is a good path for them to identify and classify that information so that, it can deploy some sort of protection?
Yeah. So I think that there are two things to think about here with unstructured data, or even just data in general. There's what you want to protect and what you don't, just two basic principles. So there are factors that would shape classification, like, for example, what might be subject, what we were just talking about, what might be subject to privacy or maybe industry regulations, like, obviously privacy, CCPA or GDPR, but then there's other industry regulations that a lot of companies need to adhere to, like in the financial services industry, NYDFS. So classification should just in general be kept simple. So, maybe 3 labels of classifications to think about, and maybe no more than 4 at a basic level will cover pretty much all bases. And the 3 that I sort of propose are, public, meaning anything you can find on the internet, everybody has access to it. So that would be in the what you don't really care about protecting. Private, meaning anything internal data, that is generally selected based on business needs and its purpose. For example, that might be things like marketing materials or product plans. It could be intellectual property or financial information. And then there's restricted or sensitive, whichever one you choose. And that would be like the big kahuna, like the PII information that's subject to regulatory requirements, like what I mentioned before. And the thing is like not to classify just for the sake of classifying. A lot of classification initiatives fail essentially because there are just too many layers. So I've seen a lot where, if you take the middle one, like I mentioned, private, where, they'll have like private internal or private external. The point here is just to really think about what you want to happen to that file or the information, and then act accordingly or apply the simplest classification to that data. It's a matter of keeping it simple and think more about what you want to happen to the file, because lots of companies struggle with this particular exercise and overcomplicate it, and then, things get messy.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly that, simplicity is really key here, especially when you consider, how complex, an organization's overall data governance and information security management system can become, trying to create too many different variables to contend with. I think it makes compliance, especially for employees on an individual basis, very challenging. And so I think your recommendation is on point and well received.
Yeah.
So let me ask you about actually protecting the information. So what would you say are the key aspects of robust file level protection?
There are actually a few. So, the first I think is it's really important to know where the data is. So the thing here is that you can't protect what you don't know exists. So, you start with data discovery. You scan servers, file shares, cloud applications, endpoints, and things like that. And doing so will give you a benefit of knowing, having a good data inventory. And from there, you can, minimize your risk footprint by making decisions based on what you find. For example, you can delete files that are either trivial or not meaningful, or they're no longer relevant or obsolete, or they're just redundant. And there's a lot of that. Data has a way of reinventing itself. Another thing that discovery can help with is responding to data subject access requests. So in the case of like GDPR, responding to the right to be forgotten, or even the what information do you have on me question. Another key aspect, I think, would be to protect the file first. A method that we've found to be successful with our customers is to sort of pick a time frame where you find maybe anything a year and older gets encrypted. And as people within the organization access it, it'll automatically be classified. We talked about classification just a minute ago, and then protected with encryption according to policy. So the interesting thing is that FSU takes encryption to a different level. We actually add a unique identifier to each file that actually sticks to and follows the file throughout its life cycle. For example, if I create a Word file and save it, it gets that encryption plus the ID. As I share it with people in my group or people that I need to share it with, I'll grant them specific permissions, and then they make changes and maybe save that file under a different name. Now it becomes a derivative. I think we all do that. We add a 1 to the end of the name of it, or the date, or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
So the benefit here is that I'll always be able to see who's done what to it because it's got that identifier that sticks to it. So the benefit there is that it will give the company and me a much easier response time to like a regulatory audit where tracing is extremely important and needs to be proven. So I'll know who accessed it, who did what with it, and where that file is. It doesn't matter if it's in a file share somewhere on a folder on somebody's endpoint. It doesn't matter. Its location just doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think that all that's very valuable. I certainly appreciate the thought on almost a security by default position where, if you don't know, then just default to, encrypting the information, right? Because then, yes, it may create a little bit of hassle if you have to access some of that information potentially, but ultimately, it's definitely the secure position to take, and probably is the wisest decision for large amounts of unstructured or certainly unidentified data. And then I think the version control and traceability capability is really important because you're right, people end up having multiple copies of, the same document or slightly, different versions, and being able to manage those, I think has a tremendous value to almost any company that produces that type of material internally. So I definitely agree with you there. So
sure.
Let me ask you
a couple of other.
Go ahead.
Sorry, a couple of other things that I think are kind of key aspects are information rights management. So applying granular access controls. So for example, this presentation that you're showing right now, you and I have access to it, but you own it. So you may give me permission to maybe just view only, not edit it, print it out, copy paste, or anything like that. So it ensures that I don't take any information out of it or change it or share it with somebody, that doesn't have access to it. And two other key aspects, I think, would be user behavior monitoring. I think that would be a critical aspect for protecting files, because in the examples that I used before around Morgan Stanley and Anthony Lewandowski, where it would be able to give you critical insights on detecting misuse and policy violations and give you an early warning sign if there's any malicious intent from an insider that, for example, the information being copied onto a USB drive and taken.
Mm-hmm.
So that would give, tremendous insight and kind of, an opportunity to avoid that theft. And one other, in my point of view, is to have the ability to revoke access to a file remotely. So if somebody actually does manage to get some information onto a USB drive, and you detect that through your user behavior monitoring, you can revoke that access immediately, and then the files become useless to them. So in that case that I mentioned before, wouldn't be able to open it. So, you wouldn't be able to use the information. So that could go for, working with a contractor. If you have a project that ends on a specific date, you can set the date where the access is no longer valid. But if one of the people on the project quits or gets fired or whatever, you can just pull the plug on them immediately. Gives you much better control over accessibility to information that was at some point legitimately accessible by an individual or a group.
Yeah, and I mean, I can, as you're talking, as you're speaking, I can think of numerous scenarios where those capabilities would be extremely useful and very much appreciated when those types of situations arise. I mean, even I know in our previous conversations, we've discussed incident response type of situations where a company may need to have that revocation of access capability, and where that could actually prevent, having to deal with a breach scenario. And I think that, that companies should really consider the value of that in those individual contexts, because I think that they can't be overstated. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me take you down the path here of sort of, how does identity level access management, help protect sensitive information? I know you kind of touched on that a little bit in your previous answer, but maybe can you expand on that a little bit further?
Sure. So, I've heard a lot that identity has essentially become the new perimeter. And in general, that means at a network level. Only allow the people that, prove that they belong into the network in the network. But at a file level, put simply, it actually ensures that only those who need access to the file has access to the file and the information that's in it. And you, like I said, you can do that at an individual level or a group level. So HR or, a specific work group or whatever. And if I were to use the example that I used before with the deck that you're using here, Debbie and Will are the only ones who have access to it. If it somehow gets out and someone else tries to open it, they don't get anything. They can't view any of the contents. Not that there's anything personal in here other than my picture and my face, my face and my name, but
right.
I don't know if anybody wants that. But so that's the benefit of file level. Yep.
Yeah, and I can tell you that, working with clients who either as a matter of a regulatory requirement or just as a matter of, being competitive in a particular industry, when they're implementing, information security controls around data, role-based access controls are usually at the top of the list. And the solutions out there are not always very targeted, especially with respect to, unstructured file level data. And so, being able to set those permissions sort of at a global level, and having that, sort of implemented throughout the organization, seems like it can offer a great deal in terms of moving them towards that goal of having role-based access controls that they could even, show evidence of compliance to an auditor in the case of an audit or an internal assessment or something like that. So I definitely think that there's value in that for sure.
Yeah, thanks.
So last question for you, Deborah. How does file level protection, improve an organization's, data loss prevention approach, in sort of as a whole? And obviously we've talked about a lot of things that I think will fall, squarely within that. But, obviously most organizations are trying to implement some kind of DLP, strategy. Maybe you can kind of relate, FASU and what its capabilities are and how it fits into that sort of mosaic.
Yeah. So, file level protection actually minimizes the risk of sensitive data being exposed or stolen or used with malicious intent. I mean, the problem with unstructured data, sensitive unstructured data, is that there's just so much of it. And like I said before, it continues to grow. And all that does is increase the risk footprint of any business. As this unstructured data is growing, like pretty much all visibility and control is gone from the organization because you have no idea. The company has no idea how many times, to what we were talking about before, is how many times information gets passed from one person to the next, to the next, to the next, and, changed or copied or whatever. And more importantly, it's the most overlooked aspect of the business, and very often, more often than I like to think of, goes unprotected. So if sensitive unstructured data is protected at a granular is protected and granular rights are applied at the file level, it could save any company a whole lot of time and, most importantly, money. I mean, those examples that I used before with, Google and Morgan Stanley, and like I said, Krieg got lucky, but GlaxoSmithKline, sometimes those things end up, bouncing back at them, and, the victim in the entire incident gets the short end of the stick, and it ends up costing them, like I said, way more money in litigation fees, not to mention competitive advantages are lost. And, our approach with file-centric protection, like I mentioned, with the unique identifier, connected to each file, it not only helps with protection of the information itself, but it also helps with compliance with, all the regulations that a lot of companies are struggling to comply with, not to mention internal compliance, within themselves. And then there's also the industry. So, for a lot of companies to try to keep up with all those regulations and what have you, and keep, sticking and moving and, trying to dodge the bullets that are kind of coming at them, the best approach is a file-centric approach, because it cuts them off at the knees, essentially, and doesn't let the information get out any further than it has to, and doesn't allow information to get in the wrong hands.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, that the old idiom that, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, I think is aptly applied here, because I think in all the hypotheticals, that have come up throughout our conversation, it's easy to envision how any one of these situations can end up costing, a client a significant amount of money or effort or time or public embarrassment or, lost potential opportunities with business partners and customers. So, in evaluating the risks, and when we advise clients, we obviously try to take a holistic approach, which is, obviously you have certain legal exposures, but then you have all of these business and reputational exposures as well. And they need to look at those in totality and then determine, how much is it worth to try to prevent this from happening on the front end. And I think, tools that are out there that can help them mitigate or at least, significantly minimize those risks are always worth a look. And so I definitely appreciate all the information you've been able to share with us.
Anytime. Thank you for asking.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time as well. And for those of you who joined us today, you can learn more about Relic Law's multidisciplinary data privacy and security practice at reliclawpllc.com, and about FASU's data protection services at fasu.com. And Deborah's contact information is there on the right as well. And thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you all next time. So thanks very much.
Thank you.